Okay, with that, Caleb, I think we're ready to get started. Before you start presenting though, can you do a brief who you are?
Yes. So hello, everyone. My name is Caleb Gichuhi. I'm currently sitting in Nairobi. So you might hear some background noise, and those are the motorbikes. We call them boda here. Yeah, my experience I've been with Build Up for a year now, and I work around tech and peace building. My background is in ICT for development, but I've applied those ICT skills in peace building mainly and governance programs. So yeah, happy to be here, and I'll be talking about the concept of misinformation, looking at how that has happened. I mean, that how it has affected African countries, or the context where I work in. I work in mainly in East Africa and part of West and Central Africa. And I'll be talking briefly, touching on some of the examples here and then also talk about some of the tools that peace builders have been using to try and address this challenge in their own contexts. So yeah, so again, focus will be mainly on Africa. So excuse me if I don't mention some of the broader work that Build Up has been working on globally. So with that, I think I'll just share my screen and start. 1 second. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, we see it.
Okay, great. So yeah, so I'll try and rush this because so that to give us time for discussions. But mainly, I'll be looking at two things. One, just concept of disinformation and misinformation, and how it manifests itself in different contexts. And then look at some of the tools and skills. I mean, some of the tools and approaches that some builders are now using that are more focused on digital engagement. So as we all know, with the definitions, misinformation and disinformation, are sometimes used interchangeably, but ideally, disinformation is when there's a deliberate manufacture of false information to mislead others, and misinformation is when disinformation is shared by people who believe it to be true, or sometimes posting it in good faith. So, for example, you see information around COVID, and you think about, oh, it's COVID stays on the surface for 2 hours, and you think, well, let me send it around to help my community or to help my friends. And in that essence, if that information is false, then it ends up being, misinformation, and perhaps it was designed with malicious intent to harm others and to mislead. So they end up being disinformation easily turns into misinformation, and it's something that we're coming across quite often, where as much as people talk about them separately, a lot of the times we've seen a misinformation, when you trace it back, it usually seems to have started from a place of disinformation, especially misinformation that has potential to catalyze violence. So we'll be looking at some of the elements of disinformation and how it manifests itself. Okay, so example, very quickly. So I'll be looking at conflict contexts or communities or contexts where this type of information might lead to conflict. And this is one of the examples where, that really sticks out. For example, in 2016, there was rumors that was spreading on social media that President Salva Kiir had died. And this is one of the examples of the posts, the worst has happened to South Sudan. The president of the republic, His Excellency Salva Kiir, had been announced dead after suffering from an unknown disease. Now, it started as disinformation, but then it moved very quickly to misinformation. People began worrying that the president was actually dead, and they were concerned, like, oh, the president is dead, we need to mourn and we need to inform our communities. But it had started as false information that was crafted to soak the tension that was really happening in the country. And as most of you who've worked in this context of seen this context of South Sudan, 2016 then, was a very, it was a very, the year was filled with a lot of conflict, atrocities and events that were happening throughout that year. So this is one of the situations where people are really concerned that if the country has no president, then we're like, it's going to now completely collapse. And we saw a lot of people sharing information not to harm really, but out of concern, like who's going to take the president seat, what's going to happen next. So we see this concept of disinformation crafted to stoke tensions in South Sudan, then quickly turning into misinformation because people are genuinely concerned about what's going to happen next, and they're sad that the president has passed. So what happened with this is the president then went out in public to try and address the fact that he's alive, and this was a rumor. So he drove around Juba, as you can see, in a pickup truck, and was trying to explain to the public, look, I'm alive, whatever was being shared on social media is a lie. And the idea behind this was, understanding that the country was already fragile and that this rumor could easily then escalate the violence. He needed to go out and debunk this story. But the interesting thing that happened was when he went round, people did not even believe it was him, and they could see that he's a president, right? But there was a rumor again that was surfacing that this is some other person who they're telling us is Salva Kiir, but it's not really him. So there were already this rumor had already stuck, and it talks about this aspect of disinformation, that it is sticky in the sense that even facts sometimes cannot challenge people to believe or to accept that, or they are being lied to, and this is false. It's because they've gone through the motions of accepting that information. So they've gone through, for example, in this case, a grieving process, and they've fully understood in their minds that he's gone and they need to mourn him. And then they see him on the streets. Now they have to reconcile.
All right, Caleb is trying to get in. Bear with me for 1 second. Yay, you're back.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. That's all right. Nothing. We can't be stopped by a little power cut. We're used to these.
Yeah. All right. Okay, let me continue. So just very quickly, then just share my screen. Keep going. All right. So sorry about that. So I was like I was saying, so it became quite challenging for people to really even believe that this was happening, that the president was still alive. And again, it points to this aspect of misinformation or disinformation being sticky, in that once it takes root or it takes hold, it becomes very difficult for for you to just counter it with a fact. Sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes it can be quite challenging to address that. And so sometimes if you think about this example, you might think that if you're in South Sudan and you came across this information, you might not have believed it, or it might not have been easy to fool you. And that's understandable because maybe most of you in this call are literate when it comes to digital literacy. But for the context of people in South Sudan, and just even how the disinformation sort of world works, the elements that come together that make it such that it is believable when you see it, and that changes with different contexts. So, for example, what is believable to you today is something that perhaps if I saw it, I'd be like, no, that's a lie, because I don't live in the same context that you do, and I can sort of remove myself from it. But once you're in a context, it becomes sometimes very difficult to try and kind of distance yourself and and view it from a distance and say that is false, and I don't need to believe that. And why that is, why that becomes difficult is because how just disinformation kind of is set up, or rather the different types of disinformation. So if you think about that story about Salva Kiir, that was fabricated content, right? And because it was playing a lot with so many other types of disinformation, it becomes much more easier to believe. But if it was just by in itself fabricated content, then you might see through it, and it becomes it becomes much more easier for you to kind of say that this is false. So when you look at types of disinformation, you can have this list here: fabricated content, manipulated, imposter content, false context, misleading content, and all that. And it's how they work together for communities, for example, that are in conflict. They work together to make it such that it's very difficult for communities to distance themselves or to actually identify this as false information. And I'll just quickly go through some of this so that you just see how sometimes they work together. So for fabricated content, that's information that is completely and 100% false and designed to deceive and do harm. And it's not based on anything. And for example, there's one that was being posted by the South Sudan nation some time back, around that time in 2016, that there was this general leader in South Sudan that was planning to massacre Equatorians. And this information was designed to stoke tensions and, and create fear in this community. So when you have this information, when it's completely fabricated, there is an element that you can say, oh, this is false. But for the communities that live in South Sudan and the context where this is something like this is not so far from the, from reality, then you might start to see why some people might believe, this to be true. And then when you look at manipulated content is where, you have genuine content or information that is twisted or manipulated to deceive. So this is an example in Kenya. The image to my right is an image of, it was an article on Newsweek about, police, the government response to Al-Qaeda, which is, most of you know. And then the image to the left was a fabricated content. So you see one is a real image, but then the other one was fabricated during elections when there was conflict, between political parties and their followers and their members. And there was a rumor or false information that the government was arming militia groups to target protesters who, were challenging the presidential result. And the marker for these rebel groups or these militia groups were that they have dreadlocks. So the image was manipulated to represent that narrative, that content, that was going with that rumor, and people did actually believe this, and they were actually going to the streets with cameras to actually try and identify who these militia groups were that the government was hiring. Well, in essence, they were not, and most of this content was fabricated. And then you have imposter content. This is where reliable and genuine sources of information are impersonated to trick the reader to believe that the information is coming from a genuine source. This was seen very clearly, even I think it's still even happening now with COVID. This is some of the infographics that were being circulated, for example, in 2020, in March 2020, when COVID was just starting. And as you can see, they have the logo of UNICEF there, that UNICEF had to step up and say, this is not from us. This information is not from us. So the reliable and genuine source here is UNICEF. And the content, the user takes that label and the logo to impersonate and say, this information is coming from UNICEF. Now start to think about how those elements work together. Now, if you take it back to what was happening in South Sudan, like I said, if you're from the outside, it would have been maybe obvious to you. But imagine you're somebody in the country and then they see something that is being shared and it has this logo of UNICEF. So already now we see a combination of the false context, fabricated content, and then we're seeing imposter content working together to kind of not only just disseminate that information, but to make you believe that because some people around that information. So this is a case again in South Sudan where this photo is circulating and people thought that this was happening in South Sudan. While this photo is true, it is not actually from South Sudan. It is from another context, and this was in Nigeria during the Biafran War. So as you can see, the post says, look at the Dinka children, they're dying because of the war in South Sudan. So people get triggered, they see this information because they don't have access to the ground, they don't know what's happening. So again, you kind of have another element, another layer there where you have the false context. And then, so this is just the accurate information is, just explaining where the image is from. Sorry. And then there's the misleading content. Misleading is the use of information to frame an issue or individual. So, for example, you see an event that is happening, everybody can see that it's happening, but the reason as to why it is happening is framed in a different way. So, you see somebody die and then say, oh, this person died of COVID. So there's the information, or rather the event or an issue is happening. It's true, but then it's being framed in a different light. So yes, the person passed away, but then the cause might not have been COVID. And we saw this a lot with the president of Tanzania when he passed. And there was all these rumors about, oh, it was a heart attack or it was COVID, and in all this type of content, flaring up. But the fact still remains that, he did pass away. So people using that information to kind of, frame it. And as you can see, this is one example during the Beirut explosion where people just jumped into some of these, platforms, social media platforms, and saying that this was caused by the terrorist regime, Israel, and, trying to frame what has happened. So people take opportunity of maybe a catastrophe and then frame it targeting an enemy, saying that this is somebody who's responsible for this. But as you can see, even as of February 2021, the exact cause of detonation is still being investigated. And then you have the false connection. I'm sure most of you have seen this. People sometimes call them, catfishing or baiting. So where you have a very catchy headline and then, but the headline does not really support what the content is. So for example, this is very simple kind of post here that says scary science that shows milk is bad for you. Very simple, it might sound innocent, but then when you read, and if you see on the right side, there's a picture of what looks like a tombstone, right? It says RIP. So it kind of starts to play around with your mind, right? And then, but when you dive deeper into the conversation, you start realizing that the reason actually this post doesn't even talk about death or anything, it just says that adults don't need as much milk as children, I think by the age of 18 or something. So it's a use of catchy phrases to kind of pull you in and dive into the conversation. We've seen a lot in Kenya, for example, with this type of content, where you see, for example, 10 reasons why the president fired his minister. And that, again, causes a lot of tensions. But then you start looking at the conversation in the post, you start realizing there's nothing to do with the post with that in the title or the caption of the title. So it's very disconnected, but it's ideally to bring people in. And then the last one is satire or parody. Most of you have seen this with memes, where there's really no intent to cause harm, but the content has a potential to fool somebody. So this, for example, is a Twitter handle of my president, well, not really my president, but what mimics to be my president in Kenya. And as you can see, the way they've labeled him, they've called him the president of the Republic of Kenya. And it was a parody account that was set up to make fun of how the country is in such a, in debt. But as you can see already, it has 16,000 followers. And some of the people in this Twitter account were actually talking to the account as if they were talking to the president, and they would say, like they would put out petitions in this Twitter account saying, we'd really want to support to help Kenya, do, for example, provide free education. And they did believe that this was his account. But as you can see, even just from the setting, it's him laughing, and it's satirical, and the idea is just just to make a joke, but then it has a potential for people to believe it. Now, if you think about those types of disinformation and how they even turn to misinformation, it's how they're used together in different contexts that make them very deadly. And sometimes people talk about disinformation as this one blanket concept, but then it's the elements where you find somebody taking a logo of an organization and then taking a picture and manipulating it and then saying that, this happened in Kenya. So they combine multiple things to frame, that information. And once you digest it, those things that you try to look for, like, oh, who is it from? Then you see the logo and you're thinking, oh, that's UNICEF. And then you look at another place and, oh, this image looks real, so it kind of, it makes it much more easier for people to digest that. So, but for peace builders, I think, we are moving just beyond the fact that, this information is out there and is making people, to believe it, but we also want to understand what in beyond the platform, beyond the information itself, makes it such that it is, it has this potential to create violence. And one, for example, there's a need for connection within a group. So people tend to believe information that is coming from the in-group. And, the in-group can mean very different things to different people. But that's one, there's a need to connect with that group. So that need then carries that trust of that group into the information that is shared with that group. And then, of course, we've talked about, we've seen how it's easy to target people using social media platforms. So with algorithms and ad and advertisements, you can actually target a particular demographic and with specific information that you know that they will believe based on their demographic. And then the information ecosystem that keeps on feeding onto the information and making it spread like wildfire. Because in a recent work, we've seen some people who tend to believe information that is trending, because they think to believe it's everybody is of the same opinion. But sometimes we've seen that in this information ecosystem, you have bots that sometimes regurgitate information. So something can be trending, but it's not actually being delivered by human beings. It's actually being delivered by bots. So when you see it at the top of your thread or you see it at the top of your feed, there's a tendency maybe then for other people to believe it just because you see it has 1,000 likes or something like that, and they're not maybe organically generated. And then we look at enabling the enabling information ecosystem, that where there is regular access to the internet and telecommunication networks, and there's low media literacy, and then paired with polarization connected to conflict, with few fact-checking services and few information services, then there's a high prevalence of misinformation or disinformation. And we've seen this, for example, like in what I've just shared in South Sudan. We've seen this again even in Kenya, because I think recently is when we started having fact-checking organizations. So we had regular access to telecommunication networks, low media literacy, polarization due to politics. But then when it comes to fact-checking, people fact-check with their family members, they fact-check with with their colleagues at work. And then information services, while there are many, some of them even do not have the, this fact-checking sort of sections that can verify some of the information that is out there. Or rather, maybe sometimes it takes quite a long time, and by the time it's fact-checked, then already people have believed what the information was, and now it becomes this key element, now becomes quite relevant. So the question is, we all know all this, but how people are addressing it? What are some of the tools we've seen, or some of the tools we're applying as peace builders in our work? So one, there are a couple of things. One, the digital tools that we've seen to work are sort of divided into two. One is on the digital monitoring side, and then the other one is a digital identification. I'll get to them in a bit. But with using these tools, we're always trying to be aware of context. Like I mentioned, what will trend in South Sudan is totally different from what will trend, for example, in Nigeria or South Africa. And also being aware that as you're using the tools, there's an element of media literacy that cannot be stressed enough, that no matter how well you structure your whatever campaign, whether it's debunking, if there's no literacy, media literacy on, if the community has low levels of media literacy, you're facing an uphill task to try and address that misinformation, because then you might also be targeted as somebody who's spreading misinformation. We've seen this in the US, where news sites were being called fake news, where they were trying to, address some of the, issues that were false. So it can easily turn on you if this aspect of digital literacy is not addressed. So some of the tools we look at are image and video verification tools, metadata gathering tools, text verification tools, account authenticity tools, and fact-checking tools. These are basically platforms that I can also jump into very quickly. So image verification tools, I'm sure most of you maybe have seen this, but for image, for example, that image I showed you of the militia in Kenya, that was actually verified by Google Image Search. And with Google Image Search, you just take the image, and then again you search for such images that appear online, and you kind of see which ones are manipulated, which ones are the originals, and then you compare that by date, which ones came early. Because sometimes you'll see multiple manipulated images, and you're trying to figure out which one is the earliest one, which is the original one. So these are some of the tools, that peace builders have been using in the past to try and address, to identify images that have been manipulated. And then also there's the video verification tools. So there's one by Amnesty International. It's called the YouTube Data Viewer. What it does, it just gives you the metadata of the video, and it helps you know who posted the video, when, where, which date, so that if you see a video today, but then maybe this is an old video that was used 2 years back, you can actually get that information. And then also the InVid verification plugin works in the same way, where it allows you to even pause a video, take a screenshot, and then verify that screenshot using an image verifier tool, or even you can even put the image through Google image search. And then there's a metadata gathering tools. So these are elements that, I mean, they're tools that help you to look at elements in documents. So you see, we've seen this a lot in Kenya, where a document will be circulated by an embassy saying that the embassy supports a political candidate, or the government is supporting the eviction of people from a particular region. It creates a lot of tensions, and people are up in arms. But then when you look at the document where it was developed, where it was who's behind the document, you're able to see a lot of information that this is actually not linked to any government organization. And that comes in when you use tools such as the metadata to go, because it allows you to look at details, for example, in your PDF that are hidden, that, for example, show who created the document, when it was created, when it was edited. And with this information, then you can easily say that, look, you can have some more information before even before determining whether the document is, tampered with or not. Photo forensics does the same, but for photos, it will give you information about photos, when they were taken, where they were taken. But some of these tools depend on the technologies that we have. So for example, when you take a photo with your phone and you disable for example, the geolocation. So even if you take the image, you take the photo, the image will still not have that information. So it's usually like a hit or miss, because you kind of want to try different tools to see which ones will give you this information. And then you have the text verification tools, and these are just the basic ones. There are other more advanced ones that are used at a fee or at a cost, but these ones are the free to use tools that can be used to verify speech. Text that is written somewhere or anytime. You can actually use the Google Advanced Search to look for a specific text or speech that was said by someone at any given time, just to check if it was actually said and whether it was true. And then you have these other tools here that are account authenticity tools. So this has helped us a lot, just to see which accounts are real, which ones are being managed by by actors that are shady and things like that. So for the Botometer, it just helps you check which tweets which tweet accounts are actually bots and not humans. So it kind of gives you a scale where a Twitter account behaves more like a robot rather than a human. And then the page transparency for Facebook lets you know the managers of a page and where they're residing. So for example, give an example in Kenya, during the elections, we saw a lot of pages being managed by Ukrainians and Russians, but they were in Swahili, and they had posts up in there, but people were residing in Ukraine and Russia, specifically Ukraine and Russia. So at first people thought maybe it's just Kenyans who are in Ukraine managing these pages, but later it was found that some of these pages were taken down by Facebook, that they were part of this ecosystem of infiltration by malicious actors to to sway political opinion. And then website reputation checker kind of lets you also check malicious websites that maybe are set up during different times, different periods, to put out information that is not really legit, and to have people believe that it's true. Like we've seen the imposter sort of aspect with disinformation, where somebody puts up a pay or an infographic and puts in the a logo of UNICEF. So you can imagine where a website is actually set up and has all the logos and everything, and it's clickable, and it kind of gives you that false feeling of this is true. It kind of gives you that feeling that this is true, but initially it's actually being set up to harm. And then these are some of the platforms in the region that have been used to kind of do this work. So these are just fact-checking platforms that allow you to to go in and look at some information perhaps that you don't know whether it's true or false. So Africa Check works mostly throughout Africa. Pesa Check is linked towards Kenya, focuses on economics. We've seen it also being applied in Eastern Africa as well. 211 Check mainly South Sudan, but expanded to Cameroon as well. And then Unhakika is Kenyan based, and then Hagiga Wahid is South Sudan. So they all have various ways of approaching fact checking, but they kind of create this space where if something is not clear, you can always go in and check. So they become partners in this sort of approach to addressing misinformation, disinformation with this issue in conflict settings. And then these are other tools, just they start now. They are easy to use and readily available, but then they're somewhat, I wouldn't say technical, but they just need a bit of tinkering around with. So you have the CrowdTangle link checker, which kind of shows you how far or how wide a link is being shared. So what they allow you to do is check, for example, if people are saying this, we've had this information that is spreading across social media, you're able to check, take a link that has an image or a text or a photo and see how far it's being circulated, on which platforms it's being circulated. So this is run by CrowdTangle, which is, I think, is a partner of Facebook. And then you have Hoaxy, which does the same thing, kind of shows you the network, but on Twitter, of how information is spreading. And this kind of lets you know where you are in that ecosystem. So before you even dive in, you kind of know, okay, this is spread, it's really wide. It's not just starting out. It has been spreading for the last 2 days or 3 days, and it's becoming viral. And kind of gives you an idea before you try to jump in and say, let me address this. Oops. Okay. So this is a bit messed up, but let's see if I can quickly just change this. One second.
While you're figuring that out, Caleb, I just wanted to call in Tim's comment, who said he wished he could have these kind of tools as easily accessible on his browser as the social media links, which some of those you can, right? They're browser plugins, like the CrowdTangle one.
Yeah. So quick question. Can you see my screen on the PowerPoint?
Yep, we can see it. And the text is mostly fixed. The connected communities approach.
Yeah. Okay, I can work with this.
Yeah.
So these tools, actually the reason why we hand selected these tools is that they're readily available and they can be used. The CrowdTangle is a plugin. Hoaxy is just a site where you can go in and check in. So now those are the tools, but we try and move away from this technocentric approach that the tools are going to fix the problem. But we also try and see how can the tools work with other approach, like the general approaches to addressing misinformation, because you might have all the tools in the world, but then your approach is still flawed. So there are a few approaches here that can be used by peace builders to get ahead of the curve in terms of work with communities to address misinformation, because it's working with the communities that are already in those spaces. Sorry, yeah. So one is the connected communities approach, where you view them as connected people and not just as audience who are ingesting the information. And what happens with this approach is communities collectively learn that information is coming in and it's going to be false at one point, and we need to learn how to counter and adapt to this information. And they create their own norms to protect themselves from manipulation. So they are not really just audiences who are sitting and they're passive, but they create this norm. So I'll give you an example. I belong to a WhatsApp group where for whatever reason we talk about, we cannot never bring in politics into that group. So we've agreed that that's a norm, right? It's a social group. We don't talk about politics because people have different opinions, and misinformation can easily come in. And so when people start creating those norms, they kind of start to protect themselves from misinformation. But again, those norms need to come from a place of learning, not just saying, oh, we're not going to accept misinformation, but how are we really going to do that? So it's like collectively learn, like, oh, when misinformation in our context happens like this, so we need to counter and adapt it by one, knowing that when anything comes and has this sort of markers, we're not going to allow it, or we are going to fact check it first before we put it into the group. So these norms kind of protect groups from manipulation. So it's like they're connected in that they want to work together to protect themselves. And then the other one is a truth sandwich approach. So this one has gotten a bit of there's a debate around this one. So the truth sandwich says that when you're addressing with disinformation, unlike Salva Kiir, who went into the limelight and said, I am here, and people didn't even believe him, it says it's about structuring your statements. And you start with the truth, it's like the first frame gets advantage. And then you indicate the lie. That's like, think about making a sandwich, and then repeat the truth. And what that means is, for example, in this case, like, when the government agencies try to respond on social media, they were like saying, he's alive. And people were like, give us proof. So the first thing is, the fact was he's alive. But then the second section was to address the lie, the fact that, yes, this information has been spreading. We've seen it on social media, and we are aware of it, that it has been spreading. So making sure that the people you're talking to know that you're also aware. Otherwise, they look at you and think you're naive, that you haven't even, you don't know this information. And then repeating that while this information is spreading, it is not really the truth. And you can read more about the truth sandwich, or the fact fallacy fact approach to addressing this information, misinformation, disinformation. And then there's pre-banking. This is one I love very much, because pre-banking sets up the stage to anticipate misinformation before it even lands. So for example, you're heading into an election, there's going to be a lot of misinformation. So you can easily sit and wait for it to land and run after it, trying to debunk it, or you can anticipate what's going to happen. So for example, I anticipate in the Kenyan elections that there's going to be misinformation about rigging or election fraud or something like that. So that's just the general aspect, but then getting as narrow, as specific as possible as I can, and mapping different iterations of that. It's like, okay, is there going to be misinformation about, I don't know, ethnic and whatever it is, but planning ahead and saying, when it comes, we need to be prepared. So anticipating and warning, sort of inoculating the communities that this is going to come. And when it comes, this is how you need to react. This is how you need to check before it lands. And you're using past events to prepare for future events. And I can tell you for a fact, based on what we've seen in South Sudan, in Kenya, even in Tanzania, in Ethiopia recently, based on the previous events that have happened in the past, there's always this element of it's recurring. It's just that it's a different time, different place, but the misinformation about who won the election, who stole the election, where were ballots being stuffed. I mean, that's just one example. We can anticipate that. Like now, we can easily anticipate if there's a new pandemic, what type of information you can expect. And then setting up yourself to sort of prevent that with the community, so that when it comes, people have the shock absorbers. We saw that, and the reason I put this picture here is because this picture was actually caught during pre-banking, because in the 2017 elections, we prepared before the elections, and we told people, this is going to come. If it comes and you see an image and you don't believe it, take it to Google image search. And they started sending us images like this saying, oh, wow, you actually want this and it's happening. And we're glad that we were prepared for this. Otherwise, this looks very scary. Yeah. And then there's the distributed debunking. So like I mentioned earlier, when you're looking at a network of spread of disinformation, it's good to know how far it spread, because if it's viral, then you need a different strategy than truth sandwich, for example. But what I mean by that is, with distributed debunking, it's a collective effort by different organizations, different actors, different individuals coming together and saying, okay, we're going to work the same way disinformation works. It's like when it spreads like wildfire. So when we debunk it, we also need to debunk it like wildfire. So an example of the Lithuanian Elves, what they do is, they fight trolls online. And when they find information that is false, they kind of swarm that. It's the way trolls do it. The trolls usually come and flood your information, and you have to struggle trying to get even to the thread to understand what's happening. So they kind of do it differently by putting out facts. So when information is put out and it's false, they'll come in with their numbers, and everybody will be, kind of putting out that information out there. So they are making the truth of the information trend, as opposed to just the false information. And they kind of swallow out the misinformation, disinformation that had been put out. So this has been prevalent with the Lithuanian Elves, who've been addressing issues in Lithuania that have been spread by, they call them Russian elements that spread misinformation about, NATO security in Europe, and immigration issues of accepting Muslims into the country. And then there's the concept of localizing the context. Remember at the beginning we talked about just how easy it is for you to be to digest this information or even believe it when you belong to a certain context, and that misinformation is framed for that context. So so with this localizing the context is understanding the impact of disinformation on communities. How does it affect communities differently? So when it comes to targeting, some people will actually target specific aspects of disinformation to a particular community because they know that community is more likely to believe it, right? So when you understand how this information is targeting that community, then your debunking also has to follow that same approach, so that you can easily map out and say, we are realizing that this information is targeting community X, and we understand that it's meant to trigger this community into violence. There's almost a certain intention behind targeting a particular community, or we're targeting this community so that they go to the streets. So when you understand all these elements, then for you, it becomes easy to frame and say, this information is actually targeting you because the person behind this element, they want to stoke these emotions and bring you out to the street. So these are two examples of Anna Taban and Defy Hate Now in South Sudan, that they understood the concepts behind misinformation in South Sudan and how they were targeting different groups. And they were able to use that to debunk. And one example was when stories of Salva Kiir was spreading that he had died. Not Salva Kiir, the other disinformation about Equatorians being killed. The Anna Taban group took to social media and said, look, we are in a community right now that is coming from conflict. People are stirring these tensions with this false information because we're in a peace process. So they understood the context was one, there was a peace process going on. And the second thing was, there were elements that were trying to destabilize a peace process by spreading this information. So they were able to use that and show and kind of paint it out and say, the reason why we are seeing a lot of this is because they want to destabilize the peace process that's currently going on. And people now became quite aware, like, oh, wow, actually that's, something, there's the potential to be destroyed very easily if you believe this information. And that played a very, it really helped in kind of helping people to debunk that information. And then the last one is using humor. So this is, it's debatable in people have debated this aspect in terms of the reach and effectiveness. But we're seeing it in Malaysia, and I haven't seen it in countries that I've worked in. But the idea is, the way they approach it is, for them, fear and anger are elements that this information tries to stoke and kind to work them up. So they kind of try and push people away from that into this aspect of fun and happy, and to try and let them know that it's not as bad. This is just somebody who's trying to play around with your head. So let's make light of it. It's like somebody's making a pun, or So it's one of those things that they've tested with COVID, and they also tested it with a law that they had passed recently it was a law on being able to move to China and work there. And on the red side on this image, it shows the rumors that this image is trying to debunk. So it's in a foreign language, but I can easily just walk you through it. It says there were laws that when the laws were being passed, they were regulating movement into China because there was a lot of infiltration from the Chinese into the politics of the country. So rumors started flying that if this law is passed, then people won't be able to work in China, people won't be able to visit their friends, people won't be able to even go to school in China or do business with them. And it sparked a protest on the streets, and it became very violent. So these guys went out and they put this meme, and this was the leader of the country, and he's there laughing, and he said, no, you guys are getting all twisted. You'll still be able to do all those things, but the things that the law will prohibit are, one, you cannot launder money from China, you cannot, work with them on the political campaign issues and things like that. So they just made light of the matter, and they said, you guys are overthinking it. It's not as serious as it is. It's fun. The law will still enable you to go and work. So as you can see on the green, it says all those three things are okay. You can visit your family, you can school there, you can do business. And then the other ones in red are the ones that says, no, you can't, you can't do policy, you can't fund, you can't let Chinese fund your campaigns as a politician and things like that. Just the things that the law was meant to address, and not the false information. So this kind of provides, an overview of all the different things that come together to be able to address misinformation for peace builders. There's this aspect of, using humor, pre-bunking, distributed debunking. And those are good because they kind of keep your mind aware of what elements need to come together. But then there's also the tech part, and sometimes we tend to lean on the tech part too heavily because it's fun, it's shiny, it's sexy. But as peace builders, we're seeing the need to converge these two and say, okay, we're going to do distributed debunking, and we're going to use, for example, the CrowdTangle link checker to see how far the network is. And then we're going to use, in the distributed debunking, we're going to use the approach of the truth sandwich. And our messages are going to follow that model. And then we're going to, anything that comes up, we're also going to use the plugins and the technology tools to debunk. So they kind of go hand in hand, as opposed to leaning completely on a technology tool and then just debunking it. And then it kind of bounces back in your face when people start saying, what do you know? This was UNICEF, or what do you know? He's actually dead. That was I don't know, they're calling him like a dummy who was being driven around the country to show people that, the president is still alive. So with that, I don't know if we still have time for questions, but that's it. Thank you very much.
Caleb, thank you. That was so interesting with all the examples and especially the tools as well. We do have one question. So if this is the only one, this is a good place to be. And this connects to actually the question I had for you too. So maybe we can combine. This is from Al-Maharuf, and he's asking, I'm from Nigeria. There's no doubt that both misinformation and disinformation cause a major cause of unrest in my country. Using the tools you highlighted, how can one burst many of this disinformation? And I want to connect this to my question, which is, and we titled this Misinformation and Social Cohesion. So I wonder if you could make that leap then to, like, how does disinformation and misinformation affect social cohesion? And then, to Mohammed's, what can we do about it?
Great, thank you so much. So with misinformation, the way we've seen it map onto social cohesion is, first, it destabilizes the reality of a community, right? So you're believing in one aspect, and then this information comes in and it tells you, no, that's whatever you're believing is not the truth, and your enemy is right next door. Okay, so we saw that in Kenya. There was a misinformation about COVID, that when one community started becoming sick, and the community was blocked off by the government, misinformation was that this community is inherently, it's spreading the virus knowingly to Kenyans because it wants to exterminate Kenyans. Now you can see that what that does is, the reality that you're living in is that COVID affects everybody, right? And everybody is affected the same. But then this other type of information comes and tells you, look, no, wait a bit, think about it. The government has already put in a restriction around that community, and this community have been known for crimes and conflict, and they're really trying to exterminate Kenyans. That's why the government has kind of blocked them off. So it starts to make you doubt your reality and question, is this really my neighbor? Is this really my friend? And it even becomes worse when politicians are involved. For example, in Kenya, where we've seen people being told, the reason why we don't have water is because this community that moved into this land have refused us to dig wells. And that then creates these tensions where this community is evicted so that this politician can get the vote from one ethnic group. So that type of misinformation that destabilizes the community. And we've seen also cases where misinformation leads to hate speech, where you see that information and you say, oh, those people, they're doing that, then they must be stupid, or they must be idiots, or they must be this, whatever it is that you want to label them. And that becomes the reason, justifies your hate towards that other group, because you have a reason now to hate them, because of that misinformation. Now, onto the question that was asked in terms of, how to address this information, use the tools to address this information. One is, look, the tools are not really, they are there as supporting, and one, you first need to understand how misinformation flows within your community. So is it on SMS? Is it on social media? Because if it's on SMS and you're debunking on social media, clearly you're going to lose your audience. So understand first where the information is moving. How do people consume that disinformation? And then look at what strategies can you use. So if they're using a lot of imagery where people are manipulating images, then you say, okay, fine, now we can use Google image search. But it doesn't stop, you just don't put the image search and then send it and say, oh, this was false. Think about the elements we've talked about before, where if it's a connected communities approach where you train them on even how they can use Google image search so that they start to put measures and say, if you see an image, you don't think it's true, take it first through Google image search before you even put it in our group. That way they are protecting themselves, as opposed to my mother sending me something on Twitter and on WhatsApp, and I'm like, oh my God, the country is burning. And then I take it and I send it to my, I don't know, another group, then it becomes like really, really just spreading out, and we're facilitating the spread. Yeah.
I wonder if you have time, Caleb, to take this one last question from Chris. I'll read it out so it's in the recording. How can we use social media to add to social cohesion, given so many societies are divided in so many different contexts? And this can be our last question.
Yes, thank you. Actually, this was something I wanted to talk about, and it's like a whole chapter by itself, because we saw this in Nigeria. And so the aspect of success stories is very important. And what I mean by that is, so you have this community and they've been trying to debunk news and they don't really know what's happening, right? And maybe they've debunked it and it's working and they have no clue. So while working with communities like that, it's always great to show the impact. So think about it this way. You work with a community and they're debunking this information, and you have this network of spread. And then you're showing them that because of the efforts that you're working on trying to debunk this information, we are seeing a gap here, that this information is not spreading as much as it was before you guys came in. For example, the elves, that's how they kind of encourage other people to participate, because you have this spread of trolls and then they come in and they see it's working, okay? So they start thinking, wait a minute, there's actually some proof to this, that this is working, right? So it's a question of showing the evidence base, as opposed to saying, oh, continue debunking, but showing them that it's actually working and your efforts are not going unnoticed. So people start pulling each other onto the bandwagon. We did that in Kenya with SMS, where people were able to be shown, because you reported this misinformation, we were able to inform 30,000 people, and thankfully you helped a lot, and that kind of addresses a lot of, okay, now it's working, some people start coming together to, to do it even better. Yeah.
Just to add to that, we have on the blog, Chris, and I can send in a follow-up email, another project example of using social media, which is Maskani, which wasn't directly related to misinformation, disinformation, more about polarization generally, but also had themes of that. And so I can, in the follow-up, send that success story as well. Perfect. All right. Thank you, Caleb, so much. And thank you to everyone who joined. We'll follow up with the recording so that you can share it also with your networks if you want. And we look forward to seeing you on another Build Up monthly webinar /conversation.
All right. Thanks.